Carol.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thank you. So, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I grew up in Richardson, and I went to segregated schools throughout my entire education in Richardson. Richardson did have people of color, but they just were not in my neighborhood, so and I went back and looked at my yearbooks, and there was not a single person. I didn't really know any black people. I met and actually dated a guy from Mexico when I was in college, and then as I was working, I worked with Asian people when I was in the telecom company, and there were a lot of blacks and Hispanics when I worked for the federal government. But I always just saw them as people. I didn't really have any awareness of racial inequity or racial justice. I think the way I was brought up, it just didn't ever come around. I grew up during the 60s, so there was the civil rights, and I was aware of seeing it, but it was like evening news kind of stuff. It didn't hit home personally at all. One time my mom took us over to Oak Cliff, and I was probably third, fourth grade, and she showed us the drinking fountains outside the public library, and there was the white and the black, and it was kind of shocking, but again, it was distant from me.
So you grew up in Richardson.
I did grow up in Richardson.
Okay, that sounds fun. And when did you first recognize, outside of the trip to Oak Cliff and the water fountains, when did you first recognize that the world might be a little bit different than what you were taught?
Well, I remember meeting the first person black person I ever talked to I was an older teenager, and my dad and I had gone to a basketball game, and he was picking up the tickets, and I was talking to a woman standing next to me, and she was black, and I realized at the time, this is the first conversation you've ever had with a black person. But unfortunately, I'm embarrassed to say, when I really became aware that what I was taught and grew up with is not reality was last year after George Floyd was murdered. I picked up the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, because I thought, well, what is that? Because I'm not a racist, so I wonder what an anti-racist is. And that was very, very eye-opening. It just opened my mind and my eyes to things that I had never come across. And so that kind of started me on my reading journey. So I've read a lot of books since then. And I've realized the privilege that I've had. And it hasn't always been easy recognizing my complicity and the benefits I've received from being in a racist society, but it's been good for me to learn that. One of the books I just finished reading, a white football coach at a college somewhere up in the Northeast had married a black woman. He had 2 black daughters, and a quote that he said was, "The system that exhausts them and ruins their self-esteem works for me." And it's like, oh yeah, I never even think about all of that stuff. But for some people, it exhausts them on a day-to-day to live in the United States of America, and because of the systemic racism that we have.
So you brought up something. I had so many other questions, but you brought up something that I thought was important. You mentioned this coach and him seeing his daughters up close and personal, and kind of what he felt like was exhausting him emotionally. If, let's assume white privilege wasn't a thing, how much more difficult do you think that level of exhaustion would make it for people to have basic success?
If white supremacy didn't?
If white privilege, whatever, like, so you didn't experience the privileges. So assume everyone had a basic starting point, right? Everyone started in the same place. But if certain people experience a different level of emotional exhaustion, how much do you think emotional exhaustion or psychological exhaustion could play into someone's ability to take advantage of opportunities?
If it existed for some other reason, yeah. I mean, if you're emotionally exhausted, it's harder to get things done, whatever the cause of that, emotional exhaustion is. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So now I'm asking him because you essentially named it, for him, from his perspective, it felt like his daughters were living with this every single day. And from the other studies that you've done, it feels like people are living with this every single day.
Right.
And I think one of the critiques people have often is like, well, if racism did exist, right, these people wouldn't have these opportunities. And the other part is too, even with opportunities, it's hard to maximize and take advantage of those opportunities, it seems like, if you have that level of emotional or psychological exhaustion.
Right.
So thank you for sharing that with us. So
yeah, me trying to get onto Medicare, and I'm an intelligent person who's educated, it was challenging. And so I can just imagine people trying to do stuff like that all day long, every day of their life, to get through the system and the bureaucracy. And if the system and the bureaucracy are deliberately working against you, I can just imagine it's even more exhausting.
So you acknowledged your upbringing and kind of the ways it might be different. You know, the world may be different than what you were taught, and you talked about how it really came to head for you last year. So 2020 was like the year that will live in infamy.
Yes.
For all of us. So did you watch the entire 8-minute and 46-second
I've
video?
never watched it.
I didn't watch it either.
I've seen, clips and still shots, but I've never watched it.
Okay. So what caught your attention? Was it the way it was covered? Was it the responses people had toward it?
I don't remember why that one was more in the news. Maybe because it was caught on camera and it was so heinous, and that people and the other police just stood and watched. But I guess there must have been something that I read, saw, heard that told me that I should start reading. And that's, once I started reading, it's like, oh my goodness. There's a whole world out there that I have been blind about.
So you started reading, and your reading led you where?
Well, when Billy called me and said, hey, we're going to have this team that's going to do Journey Towards Racial Justice, and I go, oh yeah, I should do that. And then he goes, and we'd like you to be the leader. I was like, oh, well, okay, you want to do something, here's the something that you can do. And so I've participated and led that group. I was active in an election for the first time ever. The church had a voter engagement, and COVID kind of made it difficult to get people registered, but I made phone calls both for the church and then for a political party that will be named unnamed. And I am not a phone person. That is not what I like doing, but I thought it doesn't matter that I like doing it. I can do it. One of the things that the Journey Towards Racial Justice did, we were following the Marvin Scott III death in the Collin County Jail, and we went to some of the gatherings that organization or a group that had formed. And again, that's not my comfort zone, but it's like, that family's doing had a whole lot worse things going on than me feeling uncomfortable about going and meeting people I don't know. So I've tried to not say no to things that are being presented to me. It's hard when somebody comes up and talks facts to me, and I know they're not the facts, but I don't have the counterfacts. It's easier just to say nothing, but I'm trying not to be silent and to call people out as necessary, or inform them or challenge them on, where are you getting that information, or I don't believe that myself, can we talk about it?
Okay, well that seems like a lot. It seems like quite the transformation
Yeah.
you've experienced over the past year. How's that impacted your personal relationships? I'm sure there's some people still around you that might say, okay, well, Carol, it's cool that you're doing that, but I don't believe in that.
My best friend and I've known her since 7th grade back in Richardson, schools. She doesn't believe the same way in many ways. And up until this past year, we've just never talked about that. It's just been kind of something. And I hesitated to tell her about the Journey Towards Racial Justice team. I thought, no, she needs to know that I'm doing this because this is important to me. And it was fine. I mean, we're never going to completely agree, but we've kind of reached the areas where we're going to dabble a little bit and stick our toes in the water, and then there's, but we're not going to come to blows over it. Some of the other people that don't believe the way I do, I'm old enough that I don't have to be with them if I don't want to be. And so where I can engage with them, I do, and where I doesn't feel comfortable to do that, I don't.
So do you have any encouragement for people who might be going through something similar, where they kind of had an awakening in some area? It doesn't have to necessarily be about race. And it feels like it may put them on the outskirts of some of their relationships. What would you say to some of those people?
The quote that I found that I really like is from Maya Angelou, and I'm going to kind of paraphrase it, but, do the best you can until you learn better, and once you learn better, do better. And I think that's what I would tell people is, don't when you find something new and different that goes against what you've been brought up to believe, or what you've seen and heard and think, don't just push it away. I mean, challenge yourself to think about it. Why do I feel that way? And what am I going to do with these feelings? And what am I going to do with this new information? Am I going to, examine it and look at what I believe and why I believe that, or am I just going to push it away? Because I think education and knowledge. I mean, I would have thought that I was a pretty progressive, knowledgeable person, and I've learned in the last year there was a lot I didn't know. And because I've learned, I've changed. And so I've got to think that I'm not the only person out there that's like me. There's got to be other people who have been brought up to believe a certain way, and they just haven't ever been introduced to some of these ideas and some of these facts and some of these realities.
So you've read a lot. Is there anything from your reading that you like has stuck with you in particular? You share with us about the coach and his daughters. You seem to be someone who's very meticulous. So is there anything you read that like I hold, like you collect your quotes is what I'm asking you first and foremost. You collect quotes or like bookmark stuff. Okay.
Yeah. I've kind of given you the ones that I had, but
okay.
You know, it kind of interesting is the book about the coach was somebody had written all the different people who have done kneelings like Colin Kaepernick did. And when he did it, I was like, yeah, what's that all about? I mean, is this really a thing? Is this really important? And reading that book and hearing about high school kids and college kids and professional people who have realized that Black lives do matter and that there is a problem and that there's systemic racism and that's something, a little something they can do, but also to hear about all of the horrible things that people yelled and shouted at them. You know, so I think, I mean, that's just an example of something that 2 years ago, 3 years ago, whenever it happened, it was like, I don't know why he's doing it, but okay. And now realizing he really did something important. So one of the things that I did as part of the Journey Towards Racial Justice team was I went to the Frisco Heritage Museum and I talked to one of the directors there. And I said, you know, I'm trying to find out a little bit about Black history and history of, you know, all the people that lived in Frisco. She says, well, there's nothing about Black history of Frisco in this museum. The people who funded this museum were all white people, and so they covered themselves. And there's nothing about Hispanics that have, you know, and it's Hispanics and Blacks are a minority and have always been a minority in Frisco. But it was just really enlightening. And one of the things she's going to try to do is to get that history into the Frisco Heritage Museum. So that was kind of shocking. And the little school that's right by the railroad track was Black only for many years. And if you made it all the way through 8th grade, you had to go and find some other school because Frisco didn't educate Blacks that were over 8th grade. And that did not get totally integrated until I think about a dozen years or so after Brown Earth's Board of Education. So I was on Billy's Bible study call, and it was Zoom, and I brought it up somehow, and I said, and I realized I was a racist, and a couple of people's faces on Zoom kind of like, because none of us like to think that we're racists.
A lot of negative connotations along with that word. Yeah. And then we automatically think, you know, back to, you know, Jim Crow and the KKK and all these other things, and you know, it's as simple as, like you said, just probably not naming or ignoring, right. Not actively opposing.
Yeah, I mean, my dad was probably a closet racist. My mom wasn't. I mean, she was, you know, a nice progressive woman, but I mean, there was no easy way on a day-to-day basis for her to do anything about it because we came into contact not at all with any people of color in good old Richardson. You know, and she set good examples, but I mean, there was no discussion back in the 60s about, let's talk about the real history and, you know.
So would it be fair to say that building relationships with people who are not like us may be one of the ways that we can begin to expand our own perspectives on the world?
Right. But I think what I hear a lot of people is, well, I'm colorblind. I just treat everybody the same. My children have, or my grandchildren have lots of friends of color. And I think when that, I mean, because, you know, even just a few years ago, being colorblind was a good thing. And I think people now need to understand that our experiences are different, and our experiences, and those differences are important and valuable. And if we just whitewash, interesting word choice there, just whitewash it and everybody is the same and don't acknowledge the differences, then we're missing out on a big opportunity to learn and grow and to really know people.
Because like, you speak about whitewashing, it makes me think about like history, because I think asking a little bit about, what our history says and how history is told. But even when we talk about some of the things that went well, like a Dr. King or something, like who he might be in his writings, as you're reading, probably very different than what we were told and what we knew, right? He might have been more radical. I don't know that for certain. I'm just saying. So thank you.
Well, and I went to I can't remember, Together We Dine, which was a virtual dinner with about 50 people of multiple different ethnicities. And I was in a breakout room with, the leader was a white woman, and there were 3 other white women, and there was a black woman. And the black woman grew up in South Dallas, was bused to a school somewhere in North Dallas, starting in 4th grade all the way through high school. And if she didn't reach a certain grade point, she would be kicked back to the local inferior school. So that was one thing. And then later she talked about, somewhat reluctantly, that she saw a policeman kill a black man. And later I was thinking, and I'd read about this before, is this conversation that you and I are having, I'm talking all about it, and it's intellectual, and I have very little emotion attached to anything I've said. I mean, a little bit, but not a lot. And that's not true for that woman last night. She talked about the horrible childhood she had, getting on a bus and riding, and the pressure to get good grades, or her education would be in jeopardy, and to watch somebody get killed by a cop. And so I think that's another thing that white people forget, is that for us it's often an intellectual exercise to talk about racism and anti-racism and what we need to do and white fragility, and it's intellectual, where we don't have any gut feel, we don't have any smells, we don't have any sights, we don't have any sounds associated with those experiences, which is not necessarily true for people of color.
Thank you for sharing, Carol.
Thanks.